Good afternoon and welcome to this exciting book talk by our author and guest, Emily Lieb. Here's Emily. I want to welcome the folks here in the auditorium who are joining us in person and also those who are joining us remotely. I first want to thank my colleagues from the National Center for Smart Growth and from the Urban Studies and Planning Program here at the University of Maryland. I am Maria Day Marshall, Director of the Colvin Institute of Real Estate Development here at the University of Maryland. I'm going to introduce Emily to you, and then I'm going to turn it over to her to talk about her book, Road to Nowhere. So Emily is a writer and historian based in Seattle. She has an AB in history from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and a PhD in history from Columbia University in New York. She taught U.S. history and urban studies at Seattle University for more than 10 years. And now she writes about climate change and global health for Durfner and Sons, a writing consultancy she helps run with some friends from graduate school. She lives in Seattle with her husband and dog, a black lab mutt named Orvy. And Road to Nowhere is her first book. So welcome, Emily. And I'm excited.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay, cool. Thank you all so much for coming and for being here tonight. I know there's lots of other things that you could be doing on your, I don't know what day whatever day of the week it is, I'm sure there's other things that you could be doing. It's a Thursday. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to be here and listen to me talk about Road to Nowhere, how a highway map wrecked Baltimore. So I'm going to kind of I'm going to do part talk, sort of tell you about what's in the book, and then do a little bit of reading from it to sort of give us a sense of a little bit of a piece of the story. So we can hear the voices maybe of some of the folks that I'm writing about. And then I'm hoping to be a little bit, I'll make it kind of snappy so that we have time to talk all together after I'm done. So just to give me a sense of, so who are we? Do we have any undergraduate students? No. Yes, a couple. Okay, graduate students. Yes, okay, mostly. And then other. Faculty. Okay, great. Okay, perfect. Okay, so we have lots of different kinds of expertise in the room, which is great. I am obviously a historian, and this book really takes place. It starts at the turn of the 20th century, but the bulk of the book really is about the period between 1950 and 1975. And when I'm a historian, so when I think about the book, I sort of think, but yeah, it goes through the present, right? Like 1975 is the present, is it not? But of course it is not. We have 50 years have elapsed since where the book ends. And obviously a great deal has happened since then. So thinking about, how to make sense of that, how to make sense of how to maybe we can map a better future is something that I hope we'll have some time to chat about. So I am here today to talk to you about something that never happened, a highway in West Baltimore that in the end, nobody ever built. And there's a map of that highway on the cover of the book, just to give you a sense of where we are. So I'm standing in like Gwynns Falls, Leakin Park, downtown Baltimore is that direction. So this is sort of to situate us in Baltimore. But like the subtitle says, this is a book about the power of a map. When planners and policymakers mapped that expressway through West Baltimore, the map alone did enormous harm. That's what I'm here to talk about today. Maps, like any primary source, are arguments, right? They don't tell you what's real. They tell you what their makers think is important, right? What their makers think matters, what their makers think doesn't matter. So a map isn't just a drawing on a scrap of paper or, even a drawing in your phone, right? It's a representation of a way of seeing the world that, depending on who draws it, has enormous power on its own to destroy. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that process worked in one neighborhood, a middle-class Black homeowners neighborhood in West Baltimore called Rosemont, which we see here on the cover of the book. And then we'll think together about how we, and really you, might map a different future for our cities and our neighborhoods. So first, I will rewind and tell you a little bit about how I found this story, how the book started. So I don't know if any of you have done research in archives before, but typically when you do archival research, you have to sort of go in and know a little bit about what you're looking for. They don't typically let you just go in and like wreak havoc in the boxes. But when I was in graduate school in New York, I was thinking of writing a dissertation on, I don't know what, something else. And I went to the Baltimore City Archives first because I had a friend who was driving to Washington, D.C. And so I was getting like a free ride to Baltimore. So I took it. And I went to the Baltimore City Archives. And at that time, the archives were not where they are now. And they had sort of open stacks. And so I was just looking through boxes in the Baltimore City Archives. And I found a box that just was labeled Baltimore City Department of Housing and Community Development. And it was filled with photographs. And a couple of them are reproduced. If you have the book, a couple of them are reproduced. There's one on page 129, for example. So there's photographs of row houses. And they were falling down. Some of them have broken windows. Some of them, the awnings are falling off. The fences are sort of tumbling down, right? But I knew enough about row house architecture to know that these are not old houses. These photographs were taken in the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s. These weren't, teeny tiny, like 19th century row houses, right? They're what's known as daylight row houses. They sit back from the street. They have bigger windows, right? I knew these were not old houses. And I knew that they had been built to be good, solid houses. And from what little I knew about West Baltimore, I knew that the people who had lived in them really loved these houses and cared for them. So I just thought to myself, like, what is happening in these pictures, right? Like, why do these houses look like this? And that is sort of how I started to think, that question is what sort of has been percolating in my head since then. And this book is the answer to that question. And the thing is, I think we might all think that we sort of know the answer to that question, just sort of, again, like just kind of atmospherically, right? When often we think about Baltimore in pop culture, the way that Baltimore gets represented, gets talked about by policymakers, we get sort of inured to images like these, right? Like, it's Baltimore. Baltimore is falling apart. But the thing I'm going to say over and over tonight, and the thing that I really like, this is the takeaway in general for no matter what you do, no matter what you do in your lives, the cities that we have are the cities that we build. We, and by we here, I mean the people who have the power, like the people in this room, right? We choose our choices. Nothing is an accident. And so there's always an action, right, that caused our everything has a context. Everything has a history. Everything has a reason. When your professors yell at you to never use the passive voice in your writing, that's because it's terrible to read the passive voice. It's also because what the passive voice does is, it serves power, right? It turns verbs into adjectives. It takes the actor out of the story. Was destroyed, right, is a very different thing from saying this person destroyed this thing, right? So what I want us to be thinking about is, who the actors are, what the context is, who made these choices, and what are their consequences. So it emerged over many, many years of research that the place in these pictures was a neighborhood in West Baltimore that was then called Rosemont. Rosemont was built in the 1910s and 1920s to be a neighborhood for white people, mostly white homeowners. And in the early 1950s, for reasons that we will talk about in a second, Black homeowners started to move in to Rosemont. And the photos that I found were taken not quite 20 years after that. So, you know, you're sophisticated thinkers, right? And so you might think you already know sort of the outlines of the answer to my question, what happened to those houses? But what you might think the answer is, you know, oh, Rosemont became a Black neighborhood, so the city just disregarded it or ignored it or, you know, decided it didn't matter. That's not quite right. It's not a matter of ignoring or disregard or passive neglect, right? What happened was that starting from the moment Rosemont became a Black neighborhood, the people who had the power in Baltimore looked at it and they saw basically a piggy bank. And then they decided to rob it. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. The people in the story that I'm going to tell you today, the Black people who moved into Rosemont in the 1950s and 1960s and bought the little houses that I saw in those pictures, got robbed 3 times. First, when they moved into the neighborhood. Second, when the highway map threatened to obliterate it. And third, ironically, when the city decided not to build the highway after all. In the book, I call those the three swindles, is sort of the way that I think about it. And today I'm going to focus on that third swindle, which is, lucky you, it's the most complicated one. The one that happened after Rosemont became a Black community, after policymakers mapped an expressway through it, and after they decided that maybe they weren't going to build the expressway after all. But first, I will sprint us through the first 2 swindles so that you can understand the third. So we will go super fast. So the first swindle is actually, so this is something that surprised me. When I started working on this book, I had no idea what a big role public schools played in the story of Rosemont and in the story of Baltimore neighborhoods in general. A lot of people think historically and in the present, right, that the reason that we had segregated schools, that we continue to have segregated public schools in this country is because our neighborhoods are segregated. That's sort of the direction that people think the arrow goes, right? Segregated neighborhoods to segregated schools. But I argue that, and I used to think so too, but I argue, at least in Baltimore, and I suspect, I have a very strong suspicion, but I will not claim it with vigor in other cities too. It was the other way around. Segregated schools made segregated neighborhoods in Baltimore. Baltimore was a Jim Crow city. And when the neighborhood that would become Rosemont was built in the 1910s and 1920s, its legally white schools kept it segregated. That's because most people won't choose to live where their kids can't go to school. But in the early 1950s, and well, Baltimore was a pioneer in many, you may be familiar with the many different technologies of segregation that the city of Baltimore pioneered. But the schools were the most, I argued, the most enduring, the earliest and the most enduring. And in the early 1950s, the City Board of School Commissioners decided to convert the process they called school conversion. The schools in the part of West Baltimore that would become Rosemont from schools for white students to schools for Black students. This is before Brown versus Board ostensibly desegregates the schools. At that moment, Black homebuyers flooded into the neighborhood from older parts of the city because now their kids could go to school there. And Rosemont was an incredibly desirable place to live. It's a great neighborhood. It's a streetcar suburb. It's very green. It's right on the shoulder of the park. It's an incredibly desirable place to live. So people, the minute that people could start sending their kids to school there, they started to move there. So that by the time school started in 1952, so many middle-class Black families had moved west into Rosemont and the surrounding neighborhoods that school officials called it the most unprecedented, the most historic population movement in Baltimore. And this is not an accident, right? This is a choice. It's a planning choice and it's a policy choice. And so looking back, one of those newcomers wrote, "Professional Blacks were moving into peaceful, safe, clean, attractive areas. We were buying our homes. We were happy in our homes. We cared for our homes and our families." And that was all true. But as some of you may be familiar with, the tools that were available to white homebuyers in the post-war era in the 1950s and 60s, like affordable government-insured home loans from the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration, weren't available to the Black homebuyers who were moving into Rosemont. So those homebuyers had to buy and finance their homes from the same people, real estate speculators that are pretty commonly known. You may have heard them referred to as blockbusters. And so what that meant was that the folks who were moving into Rosemont had to pay more for their houses than a comparably situated white family would be paying for a comparable house. And they also had to pay more for the money that they used to buy those houses, right? Because the interest rates were higher, right? You don't have to remember any of these numbers. I'm not going to give you a test, but just to give you a sense of like how the story kind of moves. And when we think about theft, we can sort of put some numbers to it. Typically, blockbusters bought homes from white families in 1952 and 1953 and 1954, and they paid around $4,000 or $5,000 typically. And then they sold those houses to Black buyers for at least twice that typically. And twice that is actually pretty good. In the 1960s, activists estimated that the average speculator markup in West Baltimore was something like 85%. So this was obviously not fair, but it wasn't ruinous. I will read you just a little bit from the book's introduction so that you can get a sense of what this new Rosemont was all about. So I write, there's no doubt that these financial instruments and real estate practices and the public policies that made them possible were predatory. They made life harder, more expensive, and more unpleasant for the neighbors in Rosemont. But they did not make it impossible. During the 1950s and 60s, the Black newcomers to the neighborhood built a community that was radiant with promise and full of joy. Blockbusting had strained their pocketbooks, but later studies would show that Black Rosemonters were 50% more likely to own their homes than the average Baltimorean. They spent thousands of dollars every year on upkeep and renovations. And in spite of the exploitative home loans they'd been forced to take, many did end up owning their homes outright. They worried about appearances. They fussed with lawns and shrubs and paint and porch furniture because they had to and because they wanted to. In sum, Rosemont was a nice middle-class place occupied by nice middle-class families. It was everything mid-century America was supposed to be, except that Black people lived there, and that made it vulnerable. So that's the first swindle. Now we will move to the second swindle. In the 1930s, as some of you may know, Baltimore's planners had started mapping an expressway system through the city. This was prior to the Federal Aid Highway Act, the sort of Eisenhower Interstate Highway Act of 1956 that paid for so many of the interstate highways that we are familiar with and drive on and look at today. This was an earlier version of the Baltimore Expressway system that was drawn by planners. A common theme in this tale is we have map after map after map after map drawn by like planner after planner after planner after like consultant after consultant after consultant coming in and drawing maps of expressways through the city of Baltimore. But starting in the 1930s, late 1930s, 1939, I think. Every map that those planners drew had some version of what they called at the time and what I will call all the way through for the sake of our sanity, even though it had many, many different names, an east-west expressway that did what it sounds like. It bisected Baltimore from east to west, ran sort of a belt across the middle, not a belt, like a line across the middle of the city. Before Rosemont became a Black neighborhood, every one of those maps steered the road far away. Typically, they steered the road like over there, down and out of town to the southwest, right? So it did not come across to the neighborhood that would become Rosemont. Oops, oh no, I need page 5. Okay, but almost the minute that Rosemont became a Black community in 1957, the men who were mapping the highway system changed their minds. Now, instead of steering the road away from Rosemont, they sent the road right through the middle of it. And you can see a version of that map here. You can see, literally right through the middle of it. In subsequent years, for the next 9 to 10 years, there were, as I said, a bunch of maps, a bunch of consultants. I say, often when I'm talking about this book, that if anybody, God help us, if anybody were to know how many different highway plans there were, how many different, in Baltimore, it would be me. And I don't know. That's how many there were, right? It's, again, nobody wants to own it. No mayor wants to own it. Every time there's a new, every time somebody new comes into the planning department, they commission a new study, they find a different consultant, they draw a different map. And the constant thing is that this piece of the road travels across the city, across the bottom of the Harlem Park neighborhood, which is over there. And if you're familiar with the road to nowhere currently in Baltimore, the road terminates like sort of on the edge of just past the book cover. There's like a bathtub, it ends. And so drew the road across the bottom of Harlem Park, across the bottom of Rosemont, and then up through it. But the maps didn't all do that in exactly the same way, right? This is something, when I teach about Robert Moses, planner Robert Moses, I always tell the story that he, as you may know, he was like obsessed with cars and car infrastructure, but he did not himself drive. And the way that he liked to think about the city and see the city was like in a little airplane, like have people take him up in little airplanes. And that's a really useful metaphor or way of understanding what mid-century planners, the way they thought about the city, right? They thought about the things you could see from the sky. They did not think about the things you could see from the ground. And if you go to, and you should all go do this, if you go to, next time you're in New York, go out to the Queens Museum, and there's an incredible panorama that Robert Moses built for the World's Fair in the 1960s in New York. And so you sort of are on a catwalk. It's amazing. It's extraordinary. You should go. But you're on a catwalk, right, walking around, and there's this huge panorama on the floor. And so, what you yourself are seeing that way, looking at the city that way, right, is sort of how Robert Moses imagined the city. And it is likewise how the people who were not Robert Moses after 1940, but were who shared his way of thinking about cities and infrastructure and what made a city great. That's the way they thought about the city. So every time they bumped this expressway map, it's 2 blocks that way. And then it's 2 blocks to the south. And then it's going to have a different angle, right? To them, this doesn't matter. This doesn't make a difference. They're just moving pieces around, right, on a board. But in fact, it makes an enormous difference to the people who you can't, you can't see from an airplane, right? To the people who are living there, right? Is an expressway going to go through your house or isn't it? Is an expressway going to, be next door or isn't it, right? How exactly is your life going to look if they decide to build this road? So a bunch of maps, a bunch of plans, question mark number of plans, a bunch of uncertainty. The other thing is when they would publish copies of these plans in the newspaper, they often did not include the street grid was often not included. So if you're reading the paper about, the East-West Expressway, you're just seeing a map, right? But you don't see, it's not on this street or that street. And you're just like, well, I guess there's a road through West Baltimore, who knows where. So there's sort of a sword swinging lower and lower over Rosemont for all of the 1960s. But nobody's quite sure what's going to happen. Nobody's quite sure if a road is going to be built or not. And we don't have time, and I won't bore you with the reasons why Baltimore was so late in trying to actually get its expressways built. But just know that in other cities that are having very similar conversations, they did a better job, is not right, but they had more speed. They were able to get their road construction projects started and finished more quickly than Baltimore's, which is why Baltimore did not end up building most of its highways, because for reasons I'll explain. But eventually in 1967, after 10 years of this and at least that many plans, the city of Baltimore condemned about 1,000 houses in Rosemont to make way for the road. And this is a setup for the second swindle. So what happens when your house gets condemned? You get a letter from the state that informs you of this. It says, hello, your house has been condemned for what was then known as Interstate 70 or Interstate 170. And it told you that at some point in the future, negotiations would commence. But they weren't really negotiations, as you might imagine. Instead, officials just told you what they were going to pay you for your house. And what they were going to pay you for your house was what the law called fair market value, or what a willing buyer would pay a willing seller on the fair market. But the house is condemned, right? Like, is there a willing buyer? Is there a willing seller, right? What does this mean? When we're talking about a fair market for a condemned house, we're not exactly, talking about something that has like a real value, right? So remember, the Rosemont homeowners had paid, let's say, $9,000, $10,000 for their houses to begin with in the 1950s. Then they put thousands more into those houses, as the study I read in the beginning, told you about in the beginning, showed. New paint, new roofs, new bathrooms. This was the 50s and 60s, so there were a lot of club basements, which was like panel the hell out of the basement and put a bar in it, right? So lots of club basements. All these things cost money, right? And then here comes the state, and they're telling you that fair market value for this house, for which you have paid, let's say, $9,000 plus whatever you put into it, your paneling. They're telling you that your fair market value is $3,000, $3,500, $4,000. Starting in 1968, and you can read in the book about how exactly this happened, but thanks to West Baltimore activists, starting in 1968, families who are going to buy another house start to be eligible for what the law calls a supplemental payment, and this supplemental payment gets included. Actually, West Baltimore activists got this included in the Federal Highway Act of 1968. So this is true nationwide. That after 1968, if your house got condemned or seized for an interstate highway, you were eligible for a supplemental payment of up to $5,000. But of course, again, up to, I spent a year reading all of these sort of sales documents, right? And like, there's no rhyme or reason to what people are getting offered. There's no rhyme or reason to how much of that supplemental payment you get. But even if you got all of it, right, that's still less than you paid in the first place. And so hundreds of families lost their houses and almost all the money they'd invested in them over the years. So that is the second swindle. And it happened even though in 1968, officials decided, for reasons we could talk about, that maybe they wouldn't build the road through Rosemont after all. So again, the houses in the path of the Expressway map had been loved and cherished by their owners for a generation. And after the state condemned them, whether their owners moved out or not, the houses decayed where they stood. No one could get an insurance policy no one could insure it. No one could get a home improvement loan. Nobody could invest any money in them. And one neighbor told the city that the neighborhood waited, quote, in limbo as residents valiantly tried to keep from becoming a near slum because no one is sure whether the area will become a great asset to the city or a 2-minute shortcut. The state has created chaos, another neighbor wrote. So here we are at the chaotic moment just before those photos that I found were taken. And this brings us to the third swindle, again, the most complicated one, but also the most visceral, which is sort of why I wanted to talk about it today. So far, Rosemont's story has gone like this. Baltimore created a Black neighborhood, exploited that Black neighborhood, and then plotted literally to destroy it. But now maybe they aren't going to. So what next, right? And so again, I'm telling you this piece of the story in a little more detail because it is incredibly visceral and sort of helps us to see when we're talking about, theft and robbery, we are talking about it, figuratively, metaphorically. We're also talking about literally things getting stolen from people. And the thing that I think the reason it's useful to think about this third swindle too is that it was supposed to be compensatory. This was supposed to be something that made that sort of made up for the two previous swindles in Rosemont, right? This was supposed to be making up for all the policy and planning choices that had created the chaos that we're standing in when we're looking at these, we're taking these photographs in 1969 and 1970. In the name of making up for those previous harms, Baltimore made the whole thing worse, which makes this a sort of different kind of cautionary tale from the first two swindles. So zooming out for a second, as you may or may not know, the Federal Housing Act of 1968 made redlining and blockbusting and the practice known as the real estate practice known as racial steering illegal. And it also tried to make up for the decades of discrimination in mortgage lending that earlier federal policies, the FHA, the VA, as we talked about, had made possible. And part of the way that it did this was by promoting something that the law called home ownership for the poor. Like those earlier programs, the FHA and the VA, for example, this was supposed to be a boost, not necessarily for, or secondarily really, for the people who were going to buy these houses, right? It was really meant to boost the housing market by steering poor people out of rentals and into homes that they owned. This was, again, we can talk about what the impetus for this was. But this part of the law that I'm talking about, I will not get into, but just I will refer to it so you know. It was called Section 235 of the Housing Act of 1968. And it subsidized home loans for low income people by limiting their monthly payments and covering most of their interest. The borrowers had to pay 1% interest, and then the federal government covered the rest. So sounds good, right? Like, okay, this sounds we're thinking about how to make the housing market more expansive, more inclusive, bigger, fairer. But on the ground, what this new fairer approach did was shovel all this federal money at construction companies, at mortgage lenders, at real estate businesses, ostensibly to encourage them to fix up houses in cities and sell them to poor buyers. But did they? So what happened in instead, here's what happened. What happened in Rosemont and all over Baltimore, activists had made such a stink about the Expressway system that the city had agreed to postpone, not stop, crucially, but to postpone its construction. And in Rosemont, we still have all these hundreds of condemned houses that had been stolen from their owners and then left to rot. Remember, the state has created chaos. That's what activists were talking about. While officials quibbled about what route the East-West Expressway should take and whether it should take any route at all, the state highway department sold hundreds of the houses it had condemned and purchased and allowed to rot. And these houses, crucially, I mean, this is just I guess more of a fun fact than anything. They're still condemned houses, right? They did not uncondemn the houses, still condemned houses. Sold them to the city's Department of Housing and Community Development for $2,500 a piece. And those houses, many of them, most of them, were now, as we've just learned, in pretty bad shape because they had been kind of under threat from the Expressway for 10 years and then had been, condemned and left empty to rot for a year, 2 years. And this is the moment when the city took those photographs that I found. That's why all the windows were broken. That's why the awnings were sagging. And the idea was that now there won't be a road, so the department would fix up the houses and sell them, not back to their original owners. Most of them had moved away, number one, but number two, most of them had too much money to participate in the federal government's loan program because this was specifically about homeownership for the poor, not for the middle class. So instead, Baltimore found and swindled a whole new group of people. And to show you what I mean, I will read you an excerpt from the book about a longtime Rosemonter. Her name was Ruby Macklin. She and her husband were retired, so their incomes all of a sudden were low enough that they could participate in this new Rosemont sales program, as they called it. And they were among actually just 4 of the original families who had been pushed out, who qualified to move back into the neighborhood in this new program. I will let Ruby Macklin tell you what happened to her. I was once the owner at 2412 Loretta Avenue, Ruby Macklin wrote Baltimore's Department of Housing and Community Development in May 1971. The city wanted for the Expressway, but failed. I would like to get my house back. In 1954, Ruby Kane and her mother, Cornelia Offer, had bought the Loretta Avenue house from Leroy Kappelman, sort of out toward that edge of the book. From Leroy Kappelman, a speculator, paid for in part with a mortgage from Kappelman's own New Michael's Permanent Savings and Loan. Over the years, the family had poured many thousands more into the house, using loans from the Globe Home Improvement Company and County Loans Incorporated, as well as a second mortgage from Leroy and Sarah Kappelman themselves. But they paid back most of what they owed. And in May 1969, Ruby Kane, now married Ruby Macklin, sold the house to the Interstate Division for $12,042.18. That's actually pretty good. This was $8,000 in fair market value plus a $4,300 supplemental payment minus a couple of $100 for the compliments. That August, Macklin and her husband Thomas bought a bungalow on Liberty Road in Winoak from a speculator named the speculative company called Strawman Incorporated, which is really what it's called, and moved to the suburbs. But the suburbs didn't suit the Macklins at all. Please help me to get out of this place out here, Macklin wrote in her letter to the city. I was living happy on Loretta Avenue until the Expressway came by with their mess. So help me to get back, will you? I'm going to get my house back, she wrote. Let me have my house back. Seems like a logical ask, right? Why not just let people come back? Why can't homes be turned over to residents at the same price the city paid for them with the stipulation that they meet standards after a period of time? One activist asked. It's a great question. And the general answer is that really wasn't what all this money was for. And the specific answer is that the contractors who were supposed to be fixing these houses and getting paid with federal money wouldn't allow it. So this is a pretty granular example, but it's instructive. The houses that people wanted to buy, like houses like Ruby Macklin's, were in reasonably good shape compared to many of the others in the corridor. If a house only needed a coat of paint or new doorknobs, the money that the construction companies were getting, they were getting paid, as we'll learn in a second, $11,000 per house, was almost pure profit. And so if people were allowed to buy easy to repair houses out of the Rosemont sales program, one memo said, it will so distort the contractor's contract as well as the commitments which we have made to him to the extent that the remaining deal will probably be unacceptable. The houses that are as is to be taken out of the Moralite is the construction company contract are in good condition, another official wrote in November 1971. Doubt if Moralite, the construction company, would agree to give them up. So Ruby Macklin negotiated with the city for months, and for a minute she did get an agreement to buy her house back for a mysteriously derived fair market value now of $4,700. So now if we're like keeping track, now here's a new number. But then the contractors went ahead and gutted the house anyway, by accident, they said, and the city rescinded its offer. We want to assure you that we have indeed tried, one official wrote in a letter, but we have been unable to remove these properties from the rehabilitation contract. There are 2 points here, 2 reasons I tell you this story in this much granular detail. First, it shows that the rehabilitation contract was king. In other words, the problem officials were trying to solve now was not rehabilitating the houses, or getting people back into the houses, or getting new people into the houses, or really anything about people or houses at all. It was all about all this free money that this new 1968 law sent flowing to contractors, to realtors, and mortgage lenders. And second, the Expressway map alone did a huge amount of harm to Rosemont, but this new homeownership for the poor campaign was not going to repair any of it. At least not for the people like Ruby Macklin, who had suffered, and her former neighbors who had suffered for it so far. And instead, it created a whole new set of problems, and it spread them around to a whole new group of people. As I said, Ruby Macklin was an exception, but she wrote a lot of letters to the city, so her experience proves the rule, and she really tells us a lot about what this experience was like. They were able to buy their house back after the contractors and the rehabilitation contract had supposedly rehabilitated it. And here's what happened then. In April 1973, Thomas and Ruby Macklin, this is, by the way, if you're following along, 143, page 143. In April 1973, Thomas and Ruby Macklin were finally able to buy their Loretta Avenue house back, not for the $2,500 the city had paid the Interstate Division, or the $4,700 it had initially offered for the as-is sale, but for $15,800 to be paid for by a Section 235 mortgage from James W. Rouse and Company. I sold my house in the suburbs, Ruby Macklin wrote in a letter to officials, because I had good faith in living at my house at 2412 Loretta Avenue. It soon emerged that her faith was badly misplaced. Conditions in the Macklins' cellar-to-roof renovated Loretta Avenue house were so bad that the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development got involved. The property was inspected by a member of our staff, one federal official wrote his Baltimore counterparts, and he reports the following. 1, wet basement. 2, missing bathroom fixtures. 3, damaged bathroom wall due to removal of fixtures. 4, Bathroom door does not close and lock properly. 5, lock on front door insecurely installed. 6, damaged kitchen tile. 7, defective refrigerator. 8, missing screens. 9, inoperable doorbell. 10, inoperable exhaust fan, kitchen. 11, leak under kitchen sink. This property is a recently rehabilitated home in the Rosemont project area, the official chided. The above items are the responsibility of the contractor to correct and require immediate attention. Baltimore housing officials agreed to make the repairs, and they did, but only some of them. Ruby Macklin had to write to HUD again. Rosemont complaints, she wrote. 1, water running in basement. 2, repair leaking water pipe in kitchen. 3, install screens and windows. Then in parentheses, she says, new man measured for them, but measured wrong. 4, approximately 30 to 40 rats are running in the backyard and up the steps on the front of the house. And then she says at the bottom, there were so many unfinished things to be done before. This isn't unique to Ruby Macklin. I will not tell you about what happened to her neighbors because we are running short on time, but know that this story happened up and down the condemnation corridor. Instead of rehabilitating the neighborhood from cellar to roof, as the program said it was going to do, what happened in Rosemont was that everyone up and down the line was just raking in this federal money and not doing any of it. They were basically trapping poor people in ruined houses that they couldn't afford, couldn't fix, and couldn't sell because the prices that are now being charged are so high. And I will read you just a little bit more so you can get a sense of how the process shakes out for Rosemont at the end of the book. And this is from page 149. In 1977, a group of homeowners who had bought on Loretta Avenue using the Section 235 program invited Sun reporter James Diltz out to the old Rosemont condemnation corridor. They wanted him to see, they said, how they'd been, quote, ripped off by the city of Baltimore. Since I came in, I've had problems, Shirley Fisher said. Fisher, an elementary school secretary, had bought her house with a $15,900 Section 235 mortgage in 1973 after the city's contractors had supposedly renovated it from cellar to roof. But her bathroom floor was spongy and its tiles wobbled and popped loose. The living room carpet puckered with tar the contractors had tracked in 4 years earlier. The porch wall leaked. Normal wear and tear, city officials said. Shirley Fisher's neighbors had it just as bad. Every week, I just put my paycheck right into this house, said Walter Thomas, a city sanitation worker. When it rained, the basement walls oozed. The front porch was peeling off. When Thomas's wife, Martha, took a bath, she said, I can hear something crack. And she was sure that one day she and the tub would both slump right through the floor. See that, Mrs. Thomas said, pointing to the daylight dribbling around her warped front door. Look at the houses they sell you. So I just want to reiterate again that this third swindle I told you about was what happened after the city decided that it wasn't, maybe, again, this is read the book to find out how that all goes. But after it decides that it maybe probably isn't going to build the road after all. And the result, as I said earlier, is to trap people in ruined houses and then blame them for it. So in 1974, in a box next to this box that I was looking at with all the pictures in it, there was a letter from a city official complaining about Rosemont. And he said, we have spent a lot of money on a lot of blocks that have turned out to be unsalvageable. But as I say in the book, that's a lie. Turned out to be is exactly the wrong way to think about and to explain what happened here. If Rosemont was unsalvageable, it was that way because Baltimore had made it so. So the moral of the story, the moral of the story really is at the end of the 1970s, there is no expressway through Rosemont and there isn't an expressway through Rosemont now, but there is a scar. And everybody from the original homeowners to the new ones has a very acute sense of what the scholar Peter Coviello writes, what it is to feel something cherished, wrenched and jolted into something less and then less and then less. So what can we learn from all of this? Again, nothing in a city happens by accident. The cities we have are the cities that we build. And what happened in Rosemont is what happens when we lose sight of the fact cities are for people, full stop. And so, again, the sort of the short summation of this whole tale is that to scar a city, you don't need to build a thing. You only need to make a map. So we have a lot of time actually to chat. So thanks so much for listening. And now I would love to hear your questions. We can talk about the stuff I I breeze through any other questions that you have, thoughts as planners yourselves about how we can start thinking a little bit differently about maps or draw better ones. Questions, comments, complaints, concerns? Yeah.
So,
Oh, yes. Thank you.
hi. So, I know that highways have been used in the past to really kind of deteriorate communities like this.
Mhm.
Do you feel as though data centers are doing that now?
Oh, that's a really very good question. Don't ask me these questions. I'm a historian. What do I know? I told you the present is 1975. Yes, absolutely. I think that we are still dumping our infrastructure and dumping the things that we don't want to look at, or things that we conclude would be better for the city, the community, the country, whatever it is, than the things that they replace, and leaving the people who live underneath and around them to sort of deal with the consequences and the fallout of that. So I'd be eager to hear what other folks think, but I think, yes, we did not learn from the mid-century kind of urban renewal. We didn't learn the lessons that what I would argue, I'm a pretty critical person, pretty cynical person, but they're pretty obvious lessons of mid-century urban renewal we did not learn, which is stop dumping things like infrastructure, data centers into disadvantaged communities, and then like washing our hands of it. So yeah, I think you're right. I'd be curious to hear what others think or other questions.
Oh, I'll raise a question on that, in that data centers are different, where you have places like Loudoun County, the wealthiest county in the country, or one of, and has more data centers than any place in the country. So it has that. So it's sort of a different type of story than the urban story. They've used the tax dollars, for other benefits. So I think there is going to be a story to it, but I think it's going to be it's going to be a different type of story. I don't think it's a deterioration of a neighborhood, but I think we don't know what it's going to do, the pulling of infrastructure, electricity, utilities, and what broader impacts it's going to be. But as you said, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it.
Yes, I will accept that answer. We don't yet know. Yeah. I will accept it.
I was thinking more along the lines of because you said you are interested in climate as well. So I was thinking that from that perspective.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right. That the climate consequences and the sort of resource consequences certainly fall, I would, in many cases, disproportionately on communities that have already had to bear costs of other things, but not always. And certainly, it is a story that we're still telling.
So when these plans to build the highway were proposed, were Black homeowners in the area kind of like organizing to go against it? And what was that response?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So the reason why, Baltimore's expressway system was a system. So this was just one part of it. And in Baltimore, there was a neighborhood group called the Rosemont Neighborhood Improvement Association that started in 1953. So it was just a neighborhood improvement association. And they pivoted to, as you say, to fighting the road plans, among other things, in the 1960s. Other groups that represented Black homeowners and renters in West Baltimore, the Relocation Action Movement was one of them. The Rosemont Coalition was one of them, came together. And in fact, the whole city, and Baltimore is, as some of you from Baltimore might know, Baltimore is pretty proud of itself for this. And I think fairly and maybe not so fairly in some ways. The whole city came together. Community groups from all over the city came together under the umbrella of an organization called the Movement Against Destruction, or MAD, to stop the road. Now, This was in the late 1960s, so they have a lot of tools that are available to them to stop expressway construction that had not been available before. There are the tools of the civil rights movement, right? CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality, came to Baltimore, made Baltimore its first target city in 1966. Initially, CORE was really not that psyched about the anti-road fight out here because they didn't think that their perspective was they hadn't come to Baltimore to fight for the rights of middle-class homeowners, right? They had come to worry about poor people, but pretty quickly they were convinced that this was actually a really profound civil rights violation. So we have the tools and strategies of the civil rights movement. We have a nascent environmental movement, so people are able to, and ultimately what stopped the road from being built was, you see that park there. The Sierra Club filed a bunch of lawsuits in the 1970s. So really what really slowed the road down enough that it could be stopped was concern for trees and not for people. But you have the environmental movement is a set of tools that are suddenly available. Also, this is the moment the historic preservation movement is sort of beginning to come into its own. And so the white working class folks who live in Federal Hill and Fells Point on the waterfront in Baltimore, which were to be bulldozed, not for this expressway, but for I-83 and I-95. Their contribution to this movement was to make arguments in favor of historic preservation, right? So the Fells Point neighborhood became the first designated historic district in the state of Maryland as a way to keep it from being bulldozed from the highway. So absolutely, community groups banded together and they fought. And they did, I mean, there wouldn't have been costly delays in the highway construction if there hadn't been community groups who caused them. And so for sure, the activism of the folks who lived here in, Black homeowners and renters in West Baltimore and their colleagues from around the city, that really is the reason why the road construction was slowed. Remember too, I said that because of the way, again, sort of arcane, you'll have to read about it. The reason why everything is happening so late in Baltimore also gives people an opportunity to look around at other cities that had built their expressways and say, like, this doesn't, guys, this isn't going great. This isn't great in Wilmington. It's not great. And so able now to point to the experience of other cities that were faster on the bulldozer and faster on the concrete mixer. And, really arguing that this is incredibly destructive and you will never, ever get your city back if you bulldoze it and pour 8 lanes of concrete on it. They were able to make that argument, and that's correct. Ultimately, the reason why the highway was never built in Baltimore was because community activists of all stripes slowed it down enough that in the 1970s, as you may know, there was an oil crisis. People weren't driving as much. People started talking a lot more earnestly about public transit. But ultimately, what happens is Baltimore runs out of money. And, there's the intention, policymakers' intention all through all this business, the Rosemont sales program, all of these things, is to build this expressway anyway, right? But the reason that they ultimately don't is because the city just runs out of money. And so in 1981, there's this very dramatic meeting where the mayor and the guy who ran the Greater Baltimore Committee, which is like a downtown group that was the main engine behind the highway construction in the first place, sort of they're very blue. And they're like, well, I guess we just can't have our highways because we don't have the money. And that's just going to be that. And it was a real moment for them. So yeah, community activism, super important, but not ultimately, in Baltimore's case, the reason why the road was stopped. Certainly the reason why the road was slowed enough that it could be stopped. But the threat of the road lingered long after the kind of this sort of immediate 1968, 1969, 1970 moment when we have this outburst of anti-road activism. So it's definitely, activism is a huge piece of it, but the way that the city of Baltimore sometimes tells the story is very self-serving. And it's, about thank goodness we listened to the people. This is what happens when you listen to the people, but that's not at all what happened. They had no intention of listening to the people. They just ran out of money and then could pat themselves on the back for listening to the people.
Two things.
Yes.
For one thing, have they tried to remove that section closer to downtown that was built?
There have been some, again, don't ask me. No, yeah, there has been conversation about, so they built this section sort of right here, is this earlier condemnation corridor. It's a mile and it's like 1.1 miles, maybe 1.2 miles of expressway. And the reason it was built at all was because the highway builders were getting sort of pissy, and they wanted to sort of flex their muscles. And so they really, like in the dead of night, started knocking down the houses in that corridor and building this road, even though it connected to nothing at that end, connected to nothing at that end. Certainly there have been a lot of conversations over the past, let's say 25, 30 years about what to do with that part of the highway that was built and the scar that the rest of it left behind. There has been talk of running it, like there's been talk of rail and other kinds of transit, using that right of way for transit. Larry Hogan, who was the governor of Maryland, that's obviously you're in Maryland, canceled a lot of that work in the early 2000s because he wanted to take that money and in fact did take that money and use it to build roads in other parts of Maryland. And then of course in Baltimore and in cities across the country, there has been a lot of talk about, there was a Biden administration initiative called Reconnecting Communities, which involved in many cases planning for, and in some cases actually accomplishing, pulling down expressways and then reconnecting. I was in Wilmington last night and they were talking about like lidding 95 through Wilmington. So there's been a lot of talk about what to do about it. The thing is, even if tomorrow they decided to let's leave aside the scar that we talked about today, right? If tomorrow they decided to decommission that chunk of expressway that's there, that the people call the road to nowhere, that way. I mean, talk about a scar, right? Thinking about how to reconnect the two sides, the neighborhood that actual expressway that was built tore apart. You all know this is a much harder prospect than just like, well, let's not use it anymore, right? Like it's just the magnitude of the problem and the magnitude of the solution and the magnitude of what it would take to reconnect and to bring justice to that community is, again, I'm not a planner, right? To me, really hard to contemplate. So that's a sort of a question for the rest of you, maybe, is to think about what that kind of healing might look like.
Okay, and the second thing is, in the last 50 years, has there been any efforts to make Rosewood, revitalize it?
Yes. So Rosemont. Yes. I say all the time at these events that somebody needs to write second half of this book about that, because I was talking to, the answer is yes, neighborhood organizations, the same ones, the Rosemont Neighborhood Improvement Association, the Rosemont Coalition, they still exist. And they are still fighting really hard to sort of get their neighborhood back. I was talking the other day at an event at the Pratt Library in Baltimore with a woman who lives in Rosemont. And she said, and I had said that somebody needed to write the second half of this book. And she said that, so I have 3 swindles, right? I count 3 swindles between 1953 and 1979. And she said that she counts 2 more after, from 1979 on. So the second half of this book is also going to be about the different ways in which Rosemont is getting, if I may, getting screwed. Rosemont was in part because of the damage done by the expressway, because of its location right next to the park. Rosemont was really kind of ground zero in Baltimore's, war on drugs. There was the newspaper, The Sun, often referred to the war on drugs as the second battle of Rosemont, the first battle of Rosemont being the expressway. So the community is trying to repair itself, but of course you can't repair yourself, right? When this kind of harm has been, when you have been harmed so grievously. So yes, absolutely, people are here, they live here, this is a community, they're fighting for it, they love it. I have talked to people who lived there all the way through. I have talked to people who moved into their homes in the 1970s and are still there. I would say, talking about not learning lessons, that because of the condition of the houses that were purchased in that program that I told you about today a little bit in the 1970s, people had to not only again spend way too much money to buy these houses, but then immediately moved in, had to take out loans to put it on a roof, had to take out loans to get a new electrical system, had to take out loans, like loans on loans on loans, so that before the foreclosure crisis in 2008 that we're all intimately familiar with, and which hit Baltimore in particular so hard, Rosemont kind of experienced its own slow rolling foreclosure crisis in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s, and a lot of that had to do with the amount of debt that people had to go into to keep their houses and to keep them livable, because again, there's no selling a house that you paid $20,000 for that is worth $3,000, right? And so the undertow is really strong. And yes, people are fighting back, and yes, people are having really great conversations about what is next for Rosemont. But I think we need to remember, again, how powerful how lasting that scar is, and how strong that undertow is, and how difficult it's going to be. I think not impossible, but a challenge.
I think we're.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We can do. Oh yes, thank you. One more question, and then I'm going to sprint out.
Hi, thank you. Fascinating to talk about a neighborhood was destroyed by not, putting through a highway. That's a different story. My question is, if you continue the research, do you find the city or the planners saying anything differently once Kurt Schmote, some of us lived through this, the first Black mayor of the city of Baltimore, when Schmote came in and his administration, what can you tell us about that?
I can tell you nothing about that. That's a really, really good question. And that's, I think, part of what I mean when I say it's somebody, like, I'm not just saying this, anybody want to write the second half of this book? I don't think that somebody should be me for a number of reasons. But that's a really good, how the rhetoric changes and doesn't change, and how we see continuities, and how we see sort of rhetorical shifts that maybe don't actually reflect practical shifts, right? I think I would guess, wild guess, complete guess, that the rhetoric changes and the practices don't. But that is a guess, total guess. I'm sorry that I couldn't give you a better answer. It's a really good question, and I hope somebody answers it. And when they do, I will hit the road with them to promote it. For their vote.
Thank you, Emily, for that compelling story. Obviously, what has happened, not just in Baltimore, but all over the country, to Black neighborhoods. My great-grandparents their house was a casualty of this policy. And unfortunately, a highway was built, their home was destroyed, and the whole neighborhood was completely destroyed. So we really need to look back at history and see what has happened and make sure that this doesn't happen again. So thank you very much. And
as I say, I'm like alarmingly, probably dangerously findable. So if you have any questions for me, just Google me and you will be able to find me. And I love getting emails, and I love yapping about it. So email me if you have any questions, and we'll keep on yapping. Thank you all so much for coming.
all right.
Same you.
I didn't see you at all. Because you thought I said it. You haven't seen me.
It's George. What I realized was traveling. Like, 20 years. Yeah, I got here like right